Hi, welcome back. I'm going to do another presentation. Again, my name is Mark Silver. I'm a forensic psychiatric social worker in New York. I've done thousands of cases for immigration, criminal, and civil litigation lawyers. Today's lecture is a CLE I've done many, many times, having lectured to tens of thousands of attorneys in the U.S. This is for immigration defense lawyers for VAWA cases. This is extremely important. I've, for years, trying to convince AILA National to have these clinical evaluation programs so that immigration defense lawyers will know how to evaluate cases, the criteria, challenges, and so on. They're not interested. Interestingly enough, local AILA chapters are very interested, and I've done a number of them over the years in different states in the U.S. I work in Manhattan. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or call me. I'm always available. I want to just introduce a few books that I've written. One is called Handbook of Mitigation in Criminal and Immigration Forensics, Humanizing the Client Towards a Better Legal Outcome. I recommend it because it has a specific chapter on VAWA and how to do the evaluation. It also has specific questions that you can ask your client in your office that outlines the major abuse areas in spousal and domestic violence abuse cases. Another book is Psychosocial Evaluations and Consultation in Civil Litigation. I note this book because it's usually for civil litigation lawyers, but there's a large section of the book that's really for any attorney. It helps attorneys understand the criteria and what kind of issues are available when doing a clinical evaluation. Lastly, and most importantly, I have a book called The Arranged Marriage, My Culpa. It's a subtitle. It's a novel I wrote after having interviewed literally hundreds and hundreds of abused women from India, primarily Gujarati and Punjab. I collapsed it into a novel to give a sense of the individual's a life before coming to the United States, her idealized childhood, family, and so on, and the systemic harms that she suffers in this arranged marriage in the U.S. that is terribly abusive in many ways, and ultimately how she loses her sense of self and really becomes psychotic. I do all sorts of cases, as I'm sure you are aware at this point. I do evaluations not only for VAWA, but deportation removal, waivers, asylum, U visas, detention, Adam Walsh Act cases, and to my knowledge, I'm the only criminal mitigation expert in the United States who specializes in immigration evaluations for clients, primarily for those, of course, who have either waivers or cancellation removal cases, or the clients who have issues regarding crimes in the U.S. They may even have their green cards. These are clients that have committed misdemeanors, felonies, and so on. I also do competency evaluations, and I've hopefully going to put up on YouTube clinical outlines for immigration defense lawyers on every single topic. What I'd like to do at the beginning is just note that the kinds of evaluations I do in this context for spousal abuse clients are both for I-360 and I-751 cases. I-360 is for a self-petitioning battered or abused spouse, and the I-751 is for a client who obtained a temporary 2-year green card through marriage, and she's now applying to remove the conditions of her temporary green card. It's relevant here because the clients who come to me and have the I-751 almost inevitably have also suffered an element of abuse or several elements of abuse within their marital relationship. As a result, the nature of the evaluation, the clinical issues, the criteria, the concerns, excuse me, and even the challenges in the clinical evaluation are actually very, very similar. What I'd like to do now is move quickly towards the types of abuses. I should have mentioned this from the outset, but I really try to integrate theory and practice. That's my goal in all my lectures. If you're interested, please email me Put your name in the subject line and the issue so I know it's a real email, and your full signature in the email. But I will send you back a redacted actual forensic example of this case or any other case that I do. I do, as I said, cases in every area, including criminal mitigation, so that we can apply the issues that I have in the PowerPoint slides and in the CLEs to an actual case, and then you can see the outcome in the context of a formal forensic evaluation that's written up for a USCIS or an immigration judge. So a few very important things about abuse at the outset. Abuse is not usually an event, but it's usually a series of events. In other words, the victim rarely experiences a single issue, but rather repeated and chronic stressors because of repeated and chronic physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, and other kinds of abuses, often within the privacy of the home. In other words, the victim is marinated in trauma. There's layers of trauma, and the abuser acts in a purposeful, malignant, and hateful way. There are cycles of abuse. There's patterns of harm. And I just want to give you one that's very well known. You have an abuser who is actually somewhat neutral during the week. Friday comes, he gets his paycheck, he goes out drinking. He comes back 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, terribly drunk. He's physically, emotionally, sexually abusive, and so on. He goes out drinking again Saturday, the same thing occurs. Sunday morning, he's sleeping off his hangover. By Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening, he's preparing for the next week. He stops drinking. Sunday evening, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, there's an absence of overt abuses. This is a well-known pattern that is sometimes seen in the context of abusers who are alcoholics. But I want to point out something that stands in stark contrast to this, and that is very often in cases of abuse, similar to cases of asylum, and this is crucial to understand for asylum cases, there may be no pattern of abuse or harm. In other words, the abuser may be acting in an arbitrary or capricious way without any real rhyme or reason. There may be blind hatred toward the victim, even racism, psychopathy. The abuser may be acting in a very idiosyncratic way. There may be cultural factors involved, and so on. One thing that you should be aware of is that the absence of patterns of harm actually lead to greater psychological harm. Let me explain that. The victim whose husband drinks Friday night and Saturday night and is abusive Friday night and Saturday night because that's when he gets his paycheck and he drinks and he becomes abusive, that abuser acts in a specific way, and the victim has predictability. It's terrible, it's awful, but the victim has certainty about the pattern. When there's an absence of a pattern, the victim actually suffers much greater harm because there's no certainty, there's no predictability. Immigrant women and men are particularly at risk for domestic violence. Due to their immigration status, they often have a more difficult time escaping abuse and feel trapped in abusive relationships because of immigration laws. They may have few social supports, there are language barriers, there's a lack of financial resources, among other things. Abusers often use their partner's immigration status as a tool of control, and in such situations, it's common for the abuser to exert control over his partner's immigration status in order to force her to remain in the relationship. Immigrant women often suffer higher rates of battery than U.S. citizens since they come from cultures that may accept domestic violence, or because they may have less access to legal and social services in the United States. While focusing on specific abuses makes a lot of sense, I want to point out that in many, many cases, there's something called pre-abuse. It's something not usually spoken about in the literature, but I always note it. It encompasses an erosion of trust. There's a breakdown of communication. There's often hints of real issues and subclinical psychiatric issues. And I'll often ask the clients when I see them, what was the first sign of real problems in this relationship? And in many cases, the clients will tell me, will point to, rather than specific incidents of physical, emotional, sexual abuse, and so on, they'll say, the truth is, even before we were married, there were some red flags. Or they will say, even just a day or two after the honeymoon, months and months before concrete abuses started, there were some real problems. My husband would be out late at night. He wouldn't come home. All sorts of things that really gave me pause. The first huge area is physical abuse. Physical abuse is defined as the unwanted contact by the abusing spouse to a partner. This is obviously a criminal act. It involves direct hitting, slapping, pushing, kneeing, spitting, blocking, scratching, hair pulling, tripping, and so on. In many cases, the abuser will use an object. There may be a threat of a gun or knife that is brandished. However, much of the physical abuse I see is indirect. For example, the abuser will turn off the heat or turn up the AC in the wrong season, lock the victim outside of the home, or lock the victim in a specific room, and so on. Very often, these abusers have a criminal history, and it's also interesting to ask if the abuser has been abusive towards other people, either within the family or the community in general. The next major area is psychological abuse. This involves most often control of the abuser, of the victim's mail, phone calls, social contacts, and so on. The abuser is often interested in the who, what, where, when, and why, so that they can manipulate passively or coercively, actively, psychologically harm the victim. There's often isolation, which can be psychological or physical. The abuser may sabotage the immigration case of the victim by stealing documents, such as perhaps hiding a birth certificate or taking a passport. They may sabotage the actual immigration interview in various ways by giving wrong answers, for example. Another huge issue is that sometimes I see abusers that simply leave for hours or days at a time, making the victim feel extremely frightened, thinking, where is this person? Is he in jail? Is he in a car accident? And it actually makes the abused person very anxious and frightened, and it extends the abuser's control. Next is emotional abuse. It's very similar to psychological abuse. The difference is that psychological abuse tends to mess with how we think, how we process information. Emotional abuse tends to relate to how our feelings and our emotions are harmed or manipulated. But I do ask about both. Another huge area is verbal abuse. It's defined as any negative or derogatory words directed at the abused spouse, including disgusting jokes, blaming, judging, criticizing, trivializing, undermining the person, and so on. It can encompass racial, cultural, religious slurs, expletives. I always put a few specific expletives in my reports. They're very unpleasant to ask about with the client, but they're good for documentation purposes. Some verbal abuse encompasses threats of deportation, threats of death, threats of harm. Much of the verbal abuse occurs in private, but sometimes publicly, which can cause the victim terrible shame and humiliation. And a lot of the verbal abuse fundamentally harms the victim's sense of self-worth. So the victim feels very worthless and internalizes the abuser's verbal and other kinds of abuses. Sexual abuse always has to be asked about. There's obviously direct sexual abuse, which is defined as unwanted touching. It can include physical harm. There may be bleeding, bruising, other kinds of injuries with unwanted sexual touching. Very often it's triggered because the abuser has become intoxicated with drugs or other kinds of, with alcohol or other kinds of drugs. Sometimes the victim is harmed by objects that may be inserted into the victim. There may be forced oral sexual abuse of various kinds. I always ask about sexual degradation, quite frankly, especially for men. And I also ask about indirect sexual abuse, such as infidelity, so that perhaps the abuser has gone outside of the marriage, betraying the trust of the victim, and that leads to a concern, obviously, for STDs and health safety concerns. The next area is financial abuse, which really includes the withholding or misuse of personal or joint funds, including legal transactions. Financial abuse makes the abused spouse physically reliant on the abuser for food, shelter, and other basic necessities, such as transportation money for travel to and from work. It really prohibits the victim from sending money to the family of origin. I see this very often because I have clients who have children or even elderly parents outside of the U.S., and the abuser will not allow the victim to send money to that family member. The abused spouse may suffer loss of employment or restrictions on employment. Their paycheck may be withheld. There may be a withholding of funds in a different way. I often see extortion. Extortion occurs where the abuser says something like, "Give me $200 because if you don't, I'm going to call immigration to have you deported." That's a criminal act. It's extortion. Many abusers deplete joint bank accounts, and there's also direct stealing from the abused spouse's wallet or purse or a hiding place. Jewelry may be taken, and so on. Sometimes the abuser refuses to pay rent and often spends without control, quite frankly, sometimes on drugs and alcohol and partying. There's often religious abuse, which can include the abuser denigrating verbally the partner's religious or cultural heritage. There may be racist slurs. I've had many cases where the abuser goes with the victim to their temple or church, for example, and embarrasses the person publicly. In terms of child abuse, there could be abuse and there could be neglect. And there is a question whether the child should be interviewed. Obviously, it has to do with how old the child is. Sometimes when you get a VAWA case, because it's been many months or years, the child is now an adult. Very often, the child is a stepchild to the abuser. So it's also worth asking yourself, is the child a potential victim? Is the child a potential client? And is there a derivative issue at heart? Very importantly, but really it's such a new issue that we're still learning about it, is technology abuse. This is most often when the abuser asserts control over the victim's social media, smartphone, and so on in many, many ways. And of course, a phone today is not just a phone, it's a smartphone. So that the abuser is controlling the client's smartphone, meaning the client's pictures and phone directory, and obviously telephone, internet accessibility, and much else. There may be neglect, privations, or withholding. These are acts of omission, particularly in the context of child neglect. You know, we're so focused on abuse all the time. We think about abuse as specifically the most central area, but really neglect, which is omission, especially for children, can be just as serious. Acts of omission are the failure to provide for a child's basic physical, emotional, educational needs, and so on. It's important because it reflects on the relationship between that parent and the child, but you have to understand the family as a systemic phenomenon, and obviously that abuse towards the child or the neglect towards the child impacts other family members as well. Not only the abused victim, but maybe siblings in the home or other people in the home, including extended family members such as elderly parents and so on. There are three caveats to abuse I always include. One is that severity of a single incident can be systemically damaging. I said at the outset that in almost all cases of abuse, We have people that are marinated in abuse over many months and years with many repeated different kinds of abuses. But the truth is there can be a single incident of harm that occurs that is systemically damaging. And I'll give you a very clear example. I often see people that are verbally abused privately within the home, and it occurs again and again and again. But then one day this woman goes out with her husband and he's abusing her, and they're with family in a public restaurant, and he becomes verbally abusive. Well, here she's with family and it's extremely embarrassing because it's in public. All the other verbal abuse incidents, dozens or hundreds, whatever, occurred in the privacy of the home. And here she's horribly damaged psychologically because of the single incident, because it's public. Second, microaggressions add up to systemically damaging abuse. This is huge, especially, again, frankly, for verbal abuse, where there are backhanded insults or comments made by the abuser that can be very emotionally, psychologically damaging to the victim. Next, people perceive and are affected by abuse in rather idiosyncratic ways. So it's important to ask the victim how they perceive the harm. And indeed, there may be harms that you as an evaluator may not sort of consider so serious, but the victim does. And the reverse is also true. There may be something that you consider very serious that for whatever reasons the abused client that you are interviewing may not deem as serious as you do because of personal or cultural reasons or whatever. And the last thing is people have incredible resiliency. So just because you have a client who's very resilient, don't push aside the reality objectively of what that person has suffered. In other words, you may see someone who's very resilient, they have a great ability to overcome adversity, and they don't present as particularly depressed or anxious having suffered living with a abuser. It doesn't mean that objectively the abuses should not be memorialized in a forensic report. I want to say a little bit about the profile of the abuser. Many of them look like psychopaths, to be perfectly honest. They have pervasive patterns of disregard for the well-being of others. They fail to follow the norms of society. They act in deceitful ways. There's reckless behavior often. They display general irresponsible behaviors. They disregard the safety of others. They lead parasitic lifestyles, meaning that they live and they feed off others. They display a genuine lack of remorse even after being physically abusive. They're glib about the harms they cause other people. They can act with superficial charm. They often have a history of arrests. They can be quite paranoid and impulsive. It's important to sort of ask about these things as you're going along during the evaluation, but the truth is these characteristics of the abuser should emerge as a matter of course throughout the evaluation, understanding the abusive interaction that the victim suffers. There may be culturally appropriate abuse, which of course is not appropriate or acceptable at all. But I see clients sometimes who have suffered abuse and they say, well, I have to tell you, this is what I saw my mother suffer in our home when we were growing up. That might be true, but it's still unacceptable and it still needs to be documented appropriately, and the client should be counseled about the inappropriate and abusive history that she has suffered with her partner. Many of the abusers use drugs or alcohol. They may be addicted to drugs or alcohol. It's usually a huge problem for many reasons. First of all, it may cost a lot of money. They're spending a lot of money within the context of the relationship. It's not unusual to see abuse with alcoholics who legitimately remember little or nothing about the abuse. Many of the abusers who are drug addicted, can become, quite frankly, sympathetic. Like the abused spouse may feel terrible that the abuser is addicted to drugs or alcohol. It may become a codependent relationship, and the abused spouse may want to physically and emotionally assist the abuser, directing them towards drug counseling or rehabilitation and so on. Alcohol magnifies all abuse issues. It's very, very important. excuse me, I want to talk a little bit now about psychiatric issues that occur as an outcome. I first want to say that I've done a lot of trauma cases in various contexts. Real trauma that is repeated and occurs over many months and years fundamentally changes the victim. The trauma affects them neurologically, cognitively. There's brain and nervous system dysregulation because of emotional dysregulation. Some people are in a permanent state of terror because of neurological changes. Some people never regain their emotional equilibrium. They may have constant distress and pain, suffering, feeling that there's just no exit from the pain and that it's going to be something with them for the rest of their lives. Some may feel never at ease, never confident, never secure and stable again. Some are never really able to process information in the same way again or learn information in the same way. They may lose their train of thoughts. They may not be able to find the right words. Their short-term, long-term memory may become impaired. How they understand themselves and the world around them, how they communicate, their fundamental values, how they contend with the surroundings, all these things may have suffered because they were long-term victims of abuse. Fundamentally, their decision-making, planning, even their insight about themselves may now be seriously harmed. And of course, they may have overreactive nervous systems and they may have exaggerated startled responses. There's all sorts of emotional consequences as well. They may feel chronic shame and humiliation. Fears and anxiety may become a way of life for them. They may feel constant exhaustion or overwhelmed. They may not be able to moderate their anger and may feel rageful. They may have feelings of inescapable helplessness or hopeless despair. Many have tendency to overreact and remain very hypervigilant. Their normal coping mechanisms, that is the coping mechanisms that they had prior to becoming a victim, are undermined or they just become absent altogether. Some are unable to process fight or flight responses. They may have feelings of incompetence, worthlessness, uselessness. They may feel very stupid and inadequate. Many have a constant sense of betrayal or deception or distrust of others, and even of oneself. This is a key idea. Many victims of abuse, it's not only that they come to understand the abuser as someone who was abusive, but it ends up that the victim questions their own judgment. They ask themselves, well, okay, so that guy is a psychopath, but how did I ever get myself into a situation where I committed myself to living with this person or even marrying this person? I must have something wrong, or there must be something fundamentally wrong with me, or there may be some deficit with me that allowed me to get into that situation. Many clients have a chronic distrust of intimacy after this. Often their hopes and dreams are undermined. I often see clients who had a particular track academically or professionally that they wanted to pursue prior to this, and then they just lose it. Their motivation is lost. Their sense of purpose and goals are really jeopardized. Many have a loss of faith religiously, their faith in God. Some stop attending church and so on. And some develop this kind of existential negativity that life makes no sense, life is meaningless, and so on. Obviously, many of these clients have suffered from PTSD. I'm not going to review all the criteria now. You can find them anywhere on the web. But this occurs where a client has experienced or they perceive to have experienced direct threats to their health or safety in a very overt way. Many of these clients develop clinical depression. That is when their depressed mood is with them every day, is indicated by subjective feelings of sadness and emptiness and crying. They feel hopeless. They don't eat. They don't sleep. They may feel a loss of any kind of pleasure in everyday activities. And it could be very detrimental to their ability to function. Many of these clients develop suicidality. They have chronic sense of hopeless despair and overwhelming feelings that nothing will ever get better. deep psychological pain, and they have either active or passive thoughts of self-harm. Active would be, for example, wanting to take pills, swallow a whole bottle of pills to end your life. Active suicidality, often it occurs with clients. They may say something like, I wonder what it would be like if I could sleep and never wake up so that all my psychological pain would vanish. Many clients develop learned helplessness. They have feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, which may even be delusional. Victims of abuse often feel shame, humiliation, and self-blame for ever having become intimately involved with the abuser. And yet the individual for many months or years was trapped within a dangerous environment in which they felt helpless. Many clients have recurring panic attacks, which include chest tightening, shortness of breath, heart palpitations, trembling, shaking, feelings that the world is just going to fall apart. There may be all sorts of accompanying symptoms. And the panic attacks, although they're recurrent and they're considered unexpected, more often not, nonetheless, there's a trigger that often reminds the victim of a specific kind of harm that they suffered in the context of the abusive relationship that triggers the panic attack. I always ask my clients about their bodies in the sense that, does your body react to anxiety? And very often clients will tell me that it does, in the form of either headaches or migraines, skin problems, gastrointestinal problems, and hair loss, and so on. And it's important to note these things because what I often do at the outset before I do the formal evaluation for the abuse, I'll say to a client, do you have any medical or physical problems? And I ask that early on because it allows the client to consider that before having to consider the abuse in the context of the evaluation where I'm eliciting material from them. And it helps them to sort of ferret out the two areas, even though they're clearly related. Some clients have suffered psychosis. It's not unusual for a client to suffer auditory hallucination. Sometimes I'll ask a client, for example, I know you've been away from your abusive husband now for many months, but when you're walking down the street, you sometimes hear your name being called and you turn around and no one is there. It's much more common than you think. That is a hallucination, an auditory hallucination. It's not unusual for clients to see shadows at night. It's not unusual for clients to perceive hearing doors or the walls making noise, probably because they fear that the abuser has found out where the client is living and they're knocking at the door or trying to enter into the residence. Clients also develop delusions. Delusions are false beliefs, and in such cases, the clients may become very guarded or suspicious or very weary of relationships. It's a form of self-protection. It's adaptive paranoia that the client develops a very low sense of trust in others as a means to protect themselves. I used to see this with prisoners all the time, people who've gotten out who became quite paranoid in prison in a very healthy, adaptive way. They're always looking over their shoulder a little bit, always concerned who's around them. Some clients have dissociative disorders. When flight or fight is not available, then the only option is to psychologically, emotionally remove yourself from that dangerous situation and place yourself somewhere else. And that's a dissociative moment. There's also fawning or freezing, meaning some clients, when they perceive acute danger, they will fawn, meaning they will try to placate the source of the danger and mimic it in a sense to try to reduce the potential danger that is immediately there. And then there's freezing. Some clients will literally freeze. You see a bear in the woods, outrunning the bear doesn't make sense. You can't placate the bear, but you may be able to freeze, to remain extremely still, not move, hold your breath. There are atypical issues. There's subclinical issues that should be asked about. In other words, it's not unusual to see clients that at the moment deny they're suicidal, but you ask about how they feel about themselves. You ask them about helplessness and hopelessness and despair, and it emerges in perhaps a subclinical manner. The psychosocial evaluations are done very broadly, asking about a wide range of issues at the outset so that the client feels comfortable talking about their life, family development, immigration to the United States, and so on. It's also very important to understand that many of these clients don't seek help. Psychiatric care may be anathema to their cultural background. Mental health diagnoses may be stigmatized. They may not be able to afford help. Many clients I see gain significant counseling through their church, through their pastor, or through other parishioners, and that spiritual support can be invaluable to them. It's important to try to get the report early on from a forensic evaluator such as myself, because you want the client's memories to be relatively fresh. General mental health practitioners or psychotherapists don't have the experience. The truth is they don't want to write the reports. Not only do they not want to write the reports on an abuse case or any other kind of immigration case such as deportation or Adam Walsh Act, but they don't want to go to court. They feel there may be liability involved, and I don't blame them. It's a particular area of specialty, so go to a specialist. Please be aware that many of our clients may have intellectual or educational limitations, and their ability to advocate for themselves may be very impaired because of they may be illiterate. They may not have had any opportunity in their lives to really explain their story or provide a narrative. They may not think that their narrative is even worth telling. And so a great deal of patience is required. At the same time, a forensic evaluation, it's not psychotherapy. You don't have, weeks and months or even years to elicit material related to the physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, financial, religious, cultural, and other abuses that the person may have endured. It's, to the contrary, an hour or two or three, a very focused time where you try and get this information so that the report that's going to be rendered as a result of the meeting will be complete and really reflect well the client's negative experiences. It's important that the client does not over-exaggerate and does not under-exaggerate. Some clients will over-exaggerate because they're hoping to make their claim stronger. That deception almost inevitably backfires, and some clients, of course, under-exaggerate because, and this is much, much more common, they're just terribly embarrassed. They don't consider X, Y, or Z to actually be abusive because they saw it perhaps culturally in their home growing up, and so on. All cases should be screened. I screen all my cases because obviously there's many people trying to get green cards through non-bona fide marriages, and that needs to be very seriously considered also. Professional expression replaces self-expression in this kind of case where, obviously an abused spouse needs to go to an immigration lawyer because immigration law is so counterintuitive and difficult. So too, the victim needs to go to a professional to have a professional evaluation undertaken so that their thoughts and feelings, their experiences, what they've internalized, can be asked about in a professional clinical way and a forensic report adequately produced that will really reflect their experiences in a way that they simply cannot reflect for themselves. If there's a denial, look at what issues are missing. Maybe there were questions and areas that the client did not want to discuss originally. It's a second chance often. Many RFEs, I find that the USCIS is just on the fence, thinking about, I hope to grant it, but not necessarily. Look at other documentation. But when there's an RFE or when there's an appeal and I get the case, I always think of it as a chance to really rethink the case. I speak to the client and I say, I don't want to sit down with you for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Like, I want to sit down with you again for an hour or two and really see if there's other information or areas that we may have missed or something we want to qualify or areas of abuse that need to be informed from a more detailed or a specific standpoint that you have. Thank you very much for listening today. I'd be more than happy, again, to send you a redacted copy of a spousal abuse case. Please look at my books. I also have a specific spousal abuse questionnaire in the book. I also have it in my CLEs, which I'd be happy to share with you. If you have any questions, please ask. Thank you for listening today, and I hope this was helpful for you as an immigration defense lawyer, having a much better sense about how to elicit information, what kind of information to elicit from victims of abuse, the challenges, and ultimately the mental health issues that help reflect their experiences in these very, very, very abusive relationships. Thank you.